good lunch, good food, and now we are going to enjoy an inspiring intellectual exercise. Anyway, my dear friends, welcome. Welcome to the Martin Center event dedicated to the future of the European Union, to the future of Europe. I am really happy and glad that after some time we are allowed to meet, not online, but in person, and to talk to each other. It is encouraging, and I hope that we will continue without any interruption, also in winter time. So, my dear friends, global financial crisis, but also immigration crisis, Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the war of Russia against Ukraine, have confirmed the merits and advantages of the European integration. But I have a feeling that at the same time, they have also revealed some weaknesses or unused potential of our European community. I mean, it was Brexit that had instigated the European Commission in March 2017 to come up with its white paper and 5 scenarios of further EU development. If you remember from the possibility when the EU 27 is gradually recentered on the single market to scenario when the member states decide to do much more together across all policy areas. The centrifugal tendencies that culminated in the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union also stimulated our think tank to deal with the issue of the European integration and its gravitation. The first result of our endeavor was a concept called for a new Europeanism, published in 2017. It means more or less at the same time when the white paper of the European Commission had been launched. In this paper, we call for an authentic federation in which the European integration is being progressively refocused so as to concentrate on the core areas of traditional federal competence, while outside of the core strategic areas, when integration is not needed, the EU should encourage decentralization and competition, not centralization or even harmonization. It is a concept of a mutual coexistence of the EU member states and the EU institutions, based, preserved, and developed on the strict implementation of the principle of subsidiarity. Hence, on the mutually recognized and accepted division of competencies. Since then, we have been developing this project into an increasingly concrete form. Challenges we face represent a significant accelerator of our endeavor. In these days, it is still the COVID-19 pandemic, but also our environment and its sustainability, and especially the war of Russia against Ukraine with its consequences that frame our reflection, that frame our activities. Last year, we have decided to confront our ideas about the future of Europe and its further shaping with the opinions of our citizens. In cooperation with localities, an independent global market research agency based in the Netherlands, we conducted an extensive survey among citizens of EU countries. We found out their preferences and expectations from the EU and its particular levels, especially from the EU institutions on one side and our member states on the other side. In March 2022, we decided to run part of the survey to assess the impact of the war in Ukraine on perception about the future of EU common security. In these days, as well as in coming weeks and months, we want to share the main takeaways from this survey, not only with our political leaders, in our case with the leaders of the European People's Party, but also with our fellow citizens. We want to introduce to you the paper entitled Standing in Unity, Respecting Diversity. So I am really delighted that the study will be presented by its authors, Federico Rejo, the Strategic Martin Center's coordinator, and Anne Blancs-Macheta from the Global Research Center Glocalities. The paper, or the result of our work, will be discussed by our distinguished guests and experts on the European integration, even though, oh, he's here. No, Professor Kalypso Nikolaidis. I was told that professor is also here, but maybe it is not true anymore. But anyway, sorry?
Online via.
Ah, he's online. Yeah. So this is true, but just this small information is missing on my side. So this is good. This is good that Madam is with us. Huh? Professor Kalypso Nikolaidis from the European University Institute, and my dear friend, Paolo Rangel, a member of the European Parliament, but also Vice President of the European People's Party. So, my dear friends, enjoy the discussion in our conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear President, for that very short but effective introduction. As the President sort of mentioned, I am here in a slightly schizophrenic or dissociated capacity because I am both the moderator of the session and I contributed to the drafting and the editing of the study. So I'll try to juggle these two hats as best as I can during the discussion. We have a lot of ground to cover, and therefore I will not take too much time. I'll just reinforce what the President has said. This is not a standalone paper. It is the latest contribution in a whole sort of intellectual effort that started many years ago. As the President said, it started actually before the Commission's own process of reflection on the future of Europe, which ended up in this white paper with the scenarios and then some follow-up white papers. I would argue, maybe, President, that it started even before Brexit, because it seems to me that already after the 2014 elections, and therefore in 2015-16, in the run-up to Brexit, we started to feel that European politics was changing. The old permissive consensus, as it was called, citizens essentially not engaging much with the EU and letting the integration process to advance on its own, was over, clearly. Europe was becoming, because of the polycrisis that we were seeing, politicized. And therefore, it was no longer enough, if we felt, also politically and strategically, to say we are pro-European. And therefore, to encourage that organization of the European political system as pro-EU establishment versus Eurosceptic, populist, which we saw in that period, we felt that there must be a political dialectic on the way in which we are pro-European, and that therefore the center-right, the political traditions of the center-right, Christian democracy, first and foremost, but also conservatism and classical liberalism, had to offer their own perspective on the way in which we are pro-European. And our intuition was to try and reconnect with what we thought was the specificity of Christian democratic and conservative and classical liberal approaches to European integration, which is the belief in European unity on the basis of an anti-centralist federalism that is built based on a principle of strict subsidiarity. And that this was a way to cast the center-right both against the centralist tendencies that prevail in most of the left, but also against the nationalism of Eurosceptic right-wing populists. So it was in the tradition of center-right third ways that we see in many ways, the tendency of the center-right to offer third ways, for example, between capitalism and socialism with the social market economy is another example. And we try to apply that thinking to European integration. That's the first time that we test these ideas. I feel that the microphone is not
No, it's okay.
Is it okay? Yeah. It's the first time that we test this idea on the ground, and therefore I would say, without further ado, I would give the floor to my colleague, yeah?
Video first, no?
Yes, oh sorry, yeah, I forgot that there is indeed a video that we have prepared, a 2-3 minutes video presenting the paper, and therefore we thought it was nice to share it with you first, and then we move into the discussion. So, video first.
What sort of future do people in the European Union want?
If we knew the answers, we'd be able to shape a better, more just and sustainable union.
Most reports ask some people for their opinion in the survey, but opinions change and shift over time like the leaves on a tree.
In order to get to the root of what people think and believe, we need to look at people's values. That's precisely what the Martens Center has done, partnering with global research agency Glocalities.
Interviewing people across 10 EU countries on their values to find out what unites them.
And what has changed between January 2020 and March 2022.
Of course, in that time, a lot has happened.
Here's what we find. There are things that unite Europeans. The core values of democracy, freedom and human rights are shared and keep growing. And the core value of peace has strengthened the most. And Europeans are more united on the desire to build a common defense system against external threats, as well as a unified climate policy.
One surprising finding is trust in the EU is higher in regions and countries where national pride is also high.
This suggests that thinking about Europe's future as a contest between pro-EU globalists and anti-EU nationalists is misleading. As the experience in Ukraine shows, patriotism and belief in the European project can be two sides of the same coin. This points to a bigger finding. The EU is a place united on many things and diverse on others.
While Europeans agree on the importance of rule of law, rights and social protection, people think the EU law should respect differences in other areas of cultural values and morality.
And while Europeans agree on the need to address climate change, they disagree on how much they are willing to pay for it.
Whatever the future of Europe, its leaders should take note of what its people believe and what they value. The message is clear. Stand in unity, respect diversity. To find out more, you can read the report on the Martens Center website.
Perfect, thank you very much. So, Anne, I would say that after the visual presentation, you can also give us a more in-depth overview of some of the findings.
Sure. I'm really happy to be here. We have been working for, I think, almost a year on this report. It's also my final presentation for Glocalities because I just changed jobs to the Ministry of Interior Affairs. So this is also a big closing moment for me in that respect. I will stay part of the Christian Democratic Movement in the Netherlands, where I'm part of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and my two colleagues from Glocalities, Martijn and Panos, are here on the row if you want to address things from Glocalities. What I'm going to talk to you today about is the findings of this report, and we have done this survey a little bit different than how it's usually done, because at Glocalities we're specialized at values research. And the reason that the Martens Center was really interested in getting us on board for this survey is that the center-right has a problem in recent years. And that's because of the cultural wars, because of the fringes in politics based on values-driven moral statements that pull people apart. And that especially center parties, like the center-right, but also the center-left, they diminish in that respect. And of course, when we talk about that in terms of the future of Europe, we're talking about the big dividing line between people who look at Europe from a nationalist, sovereign perspective and the perspective of a more cosmopolitan, social liberal perspective. And that has been a very dominant way of looking at Europe. And this survey is actually looking at that through those two lenses, so the future of Europe in terms of the long-term policy challenges, but also the values that underlie the kind of emotions and the values that are beneath the surface and that are driving people's perspectives on Europe. And in that respect, I can already say that up front, and I will go into the results to show it with figures. There is some good news for the center-right on the horizon, that actually this report shows that some of these cleavages that are being used in the media by political parties and are really via social media, etc., there's a lot of emotion involved in it, nationalists versus cosmopolitans. There is a lot to say against that there is actually other ways of looking at Europe that also correspond with when you look at survey results. But also that in the moment that we're in the midst of, what we call in the report, I think the Kiev moment, is really a striking moment when you compare it with the Brexit moment of 2016. And again, we can show that also in numbers, and I show what it means, but also what it doesn't mean. So let's go to the results. So this is what I just said. So we're looking at values cleavages. So one of the main results of the report, national pride and EU trust actually often go together. So this is against this dominant view of Europe of nationalists versus cosmopolitans. We have looked at how people look at long-term policy challenges of the EU, and we look at what unites people and divides people. And of course, because we didn't know, of course, nobody knew about the war in Ukraine when we started the survey, we decided to go back into the field in March to repeat some aspects of the survey to see actually what has changed in terms of these upper two things based on this big momentum in European politics. So we did it based on surveys in 10 countries. So we have our database of over 300,000 people worldwide that we interviewed, deep interviews about their values, and we combined that data with two bespoke surveys we did specifically for the Martin Center on EU policy challenges, and we did that 2 times, so before and after the Ukraine invasion. So the first part, the part where we're talking about the unity. So first of all, what happened during with the invasion is that it really focused the mind of Europeans about outside threats. So if you look, we listed a lot of all kind of potential foreign policy threats in our question. So things like migration, climate, or all kind of things that you could perceive as external threats, terrorism. And you see that there was a lot of diversity in the way that was answered between countries. And you see how Russia focused the minds when it comes to external threats in Europe. All countries, it's now the #1 external threat. We also asked about European values. Of course, it's often discussed. It was often said before the war, like, yeah, actually the old story of Europe as a peace project is dead. Well, actually what we already saw before the war, that peace as a value that's being associated with the EU is mentioned very often. And this is true. I don't have the split between 10 countries, but this is quite similar in all 10 countries. But you see that really moved up. And you see that there is a consistent pattern of peace, democracy, and freedom being associated as EU values, as top EU values in all 10 EU countries. But we also see it when you look at policy priorities. So what do you think that the EU should address on a political level? Then we saw also throughout the EU climate change being mentioned very often, and we see that based on our previous polling that has really shot up, or not shut up, went up in the last years, and it's now everywhere in the Union. It's a very high policy priority. It's not everywhere. There's some, like I think in Romania, maybe it's the 4th issue or the 5th issue, but almost everywhere it's in top 3, top 4, and you see that it went down a little bit because of the cost of living crisis since the war, but it's still quite high. So it's also a common feature of a concern that people want to be have addressed at the European level. And we also asked about long-term economic policy priorities, and there you see also very striking, again based on this outside threat idea, that protection of the European economy against unfair competition from outside the EU is the most mentioned economic long-term priority throughout the Union, quickly followed by regulating the economy with more protection for workers and consumers. So again, a kind of external threat, protectionist answering pattern. Then, of course, there's also, as we all know, a lot of diversity in the European Union. So that's the second element that we look into. So first of all, based on values. So what I said before, we ask a lot of questions to understand people's deep values, and this is the kind of questions that we use to understand how people think about values. And here you see two questions that are really pronounced in an East-West division of the European Union. So I think it's perfectly all right when men show their feminine side. The father should be the head of the family. And so, for example, if you take the second statement, the father should be the head of the family. In Poland, for example, around 55% of people would agree to that statement, compared to the Netherlands, where I'm from, where it's, I think, 7% or 8%. So there's really, really big differences. And you see, so especially when it comes to family values, when it comes to gender, when it comes to all kind of values that have to do with that, you see a very, very pronounced East-West divide in Europe. And when you take all those value statements together, you come to different values clusters in society. And this is the 5 values clusters that we use in our localities research. I won't go into the details of it all, but important to say here is that creatives is the more social, liberal, cosmopolitan, higher educated part of society, where traditionalists on the complete different side of the model are the more traditionalist, lower middle educated, more conservative part of society. You have 5 segments, and different countries in the EU have different sizes of these different segments in society, which shows the cultural differences between countries. But of course, within countries, you also have different polarities between different segments and how they interact. And then what we often, when we look at diversity in the European Union, concentrate upon is this cosmopolitan, social, liberal, higher educated part of society. Well, actually, that's not where the main division lies in the EU. Because even this segment, of course, it's a little bit higher in Western, Northern part, but also in Spain. And a little bit smaller in Central Europe, but there's not that big of a difference. Especially in countries like Poland and Hungary, you have a very significant part of society that is part of creative segments. Where the real difference lies is more on the bottom side of society, more the lower middle educated part. There you have traditionalists making up the large segment in everywhere in Central Europe, but also in Italy. And that's a very tiny group, a shrinking group in most of Northwestern Europe. While in Northwestern Europe, you have this large, lower, middle educated, consumer-oriented, more materialistic, hedonistic, very freedom-oriented in the social domain part of society. And this is where the real difference lies between East and West. Not so much on the higher educated part of society, but on the lower educated part of society. And there you have really, really different population setups. And that translates in diversity on issues. I don't know how am I on my time?
You still have 6-7 minutes.
Okay, then I'm on schedule. So you see how that translates into policy. So for example, when we take rule of law, where there's a lot of news about, there's a lot of political fight about that in Europe. But actually, when you look at the technical rule of law standards, there's large agreement all over Europe, and we asked, I think, all kind of different questions about it, and it was largely answered the same. When you frame it as respect for human rights, free and fair election, minimal social protection, EU common rules and regulation, impartial national rule of law, etc., etc. Large part of society agrees that it's important, that it should be also, the EU should monitor that, and that even, and there's majorities in Poland and Hungary that agree with that, that punitive measures from the EU should be possible to make sure that member states abide by these minimum rule of law standards. However, what happens, of course, in politics is that things get reframed in the values domain. And there you see the viewpoint diversity coming up in the survey. So once it starts to be about family, abortion, about refugees, when it's about gender balanced boards, when it's about this feeling that that your national autonomy is under threat, those aspects, then you see the viewpoint diversity coming up. But it's very important to make this distinction about values-driven standards in public perception and this more technical rule of law aspects where if you cut out the values frames, there's actually a lot of support for throughout the Union. When we look at the polarity, for example, when it comes to climate change, so I first said there's a lot of unity when it comes about that something should be done on the European level. However, there the division is partly between member states in terms of energy transition, but the biggest division is there actually within societies, and that goes according to these values cleavages that I just explained. So the more higher educated creatives and achievers are much more supportive of higher energy bills to pay for the transition than when you go to the traditionalists and socializers. And so here you see the real division playing out within societies. Of course, you have the economic divisions in the EU as well. And there you have mostly my own country, the Netherlands and Sweden, that are have a lot of emotion with their national autonomy on the economy and how they decide about economic affairs, and also a fear about further economic integration, what that means for their national model. And you see that very strong, you see that emotion playing out in this question about future economic integration. Interestingly, on the values axis, which was very dominant, of course, before the war broke out, you see this huge comparison between the situation in Hungary and in Poland. And you see that since then, rifts are between the two start to emerge. And we also see that...
Anna, you have 1 minute left now.
Yeah.
So this one, we can maybe return to it during the discussion. Yeah.
Sure. Then I think I go to the last slide. And that is how I started my presentation about this changing paradigm that is more to the advantage of the center-right. So what I already showed you, that there is a lot of potential for a united message on Europe, but that on all kind of other aspects there is also a need to speak about the diversity and to come up for that. But what we also saw, and that's more fundamental, is that actually national pride and EU trust are not necessarily opposite things. Actually, what we see when we look at the map of Europe and we look at this question, how it's being answered, we see in those places where nationalist or national pride is highest, that EU trust also tends to be higher. And that's a very logical thing, and actually in our public imagination, because of the Ukraine war, we're reminded of that. Because for Central Europe and for all countries bordering Russia or being close to Russia or having been occupied by Russia in the past, EU membership is a guarantee for national autonomy. And that was always the case, but we had just forgotten about that dynamic because of all the Brexit, because of all the cultural wars. But this is a very striking fact that is true now, and that was true 5 years, 10 years ago, but that we're reminded of again because of the Ukraine war, and that I think also influences a mental paradigm shift in how we might think about Europe in the future. Thank you very much.
If you actually continue to the last slide, just for a moment, because we have a slide on conclusions, don't we?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah. Just reinstall the presentation and give me the last slides, just because I will retake for a moment my author's hat and briefly comment on the political conclusions that we drew before I give the floor to the speakers. So this is sort of the more normative political part of our work. And these are the key conclusions. The first is that we think the EU should tap into all the political potential of its citizens' growing desire for unity. As Anne was saying, the founding story of the EU has emerged stronger from the crisis of the last few months. There is a growing demand for EU action and the growing perception that the EU can act as a shield in a number of fields, from the economy to security to climate. So we think that as pro-European center-right forces, but more broadly, we should tap into this potential to accompany the integration of Europe going forward. The EU should also use the momentum created by the war in Ukraine to build an effective European defense union. Again, the data showed that there are some residual cultural resistances on this issue. For example, in France, you see very high opposition to Europeanizing the nuclear deterrence, but there is also widespread support for the goal of strategic autonomy. So we think that this is a moment on which also to invest in European defense. Third point, the EU should help upgrade the social market economy for the 21st century, and this goes back a bit to what he was saying. There is a transformation ongoing. For a long time, the EU was perceived as being about open borders, open migratory flows, but more and more it is seen as a protective shield also in the economy. And this, of course, goes back to the discussion on the future of the social market economy, which, as you know, it is a way to combine market competition, a basic respect for the price mechanism, with also a basic safety net. And the extent to which the EU should, in the future, be involved in a multi-level social system is an issue for debate. Then the EU should strike a realistic balance between an ambitious European Green Deal and people's readiness to pay for it. Again, you see that sort of strange double positions in the data. On the one hand, overwhelming support for climate action, but on the others, growing concern for the costs of climate action. And therefore, here what we have been working on and recommending in the Martin Center is the notion of climate realism. So a strong commitment to climate, but also with an attention to the social and economic consequences of the measures. Otherwise, we risk losing the people. We risk ending up in a situation like that of France during the Yellow Vests rebellion. Maybe this is one of the more tricky and controversial recommendations. Respect cultural differences in values and morality. On controversial issues, there's risk becoming flashing points of conflicts. We recommend the EU to tone down its action, to accompany social development more gradually, and to concentrate, on the other hand, on a strict protection of the rule of law in its most procedural aspects, so the independence of the judiciary, the independence of the media, and so on. And then finally, reincorporate national and local patriotism within the EU narratives of supranational unity. And this goes back to what Anna was saying in terms of EU pride, national pride and trust in the EU being correlated, in terms of this Kiev moment showing how you can have a nation state that is fighting to defend its autonomy in Europe. And in this sense, we think that this is also a good way to reabsorb part of the Eurosceptic populist uprising that spread throughout Europe in the last decade and is not completely ended, as we saw in elections in some countries like, I don't know, Italy or Sweden. So I'll stop here, and I would like to now ask our speakers to give us their perspective. They are both wonderfully qualified for this discussion. Paolo Rangel here with us physically, he is a Christian Democrat, but also I think you don't take offense being called an EU federalist. So you have been thinking a long time on how to combine unity and diversity in a united Europe. And the same goes for Calypso Nicolaides. She's not a Christian Democrat, I think I can say that safely, Calypso, but she has been thinking about third ways approaches to European unity throughout her career, and therefore about ways in which the European peoples can live and rule together, but without losing their cultural specificities and maintaining, their integrity, their autonomy. So I would like to ask you maybe first, Calypso, to give us your commentary.
Micro, no? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Federico. I'm having a hearing in it. Are we good?
Yes.
Are we good? You can hear me, Federico. Continue. Give me a thumbs up if we're good. Yeah? Okay, cool. Wonderful. Thank you to the Wilfred Martin Center for hosting me at a distance, especially in such an important moment in your reflection. A moment I'm very aware of. Federico and I have had this conversation, I would say from many years, from the time I was still in Oxford all the way to now when I'm speaking from Florence. And indeed, as Federico just said, I've come from this story in part well as a long lifelong Democrat, but then we all know that the EU was predicated in the 50s onto a bargain between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrat families. The Social Democrats wanted to not have collective ownership of resources, and the Christian Democrats are willing to separate the welfare state. And there we have it. That is the basis of our argument. It is that conversation. So it makes a lot of sense, but moreover, it makes sense because at this moment in time, we are really converging towards a certain understanding and vision that you're sharing through this amazing, wonderful report, which I would really like to praise and recommend to anyone in the room who hasn't read it yet. It's brilliant, and we have a summary at this moment. I want to kind of just, in 3 parts very quickly, say something about what's at stake in a kind of social anthropological way, in a political way, they're saying, and in a philosophical way. Now, in terms of social anthropology of democracy, one thing that we understand about democracies that work, democracies that have that are healthy democracies, yes, they're agonistic, they're socially agonistic, they're made of all sorts of cleavages, and this report shows us many of these about priorities, about values, cultures, etc., both within European countries and across them. Now, there are 2 characteristics of cleavages that matter if we want to be resilient. One is that they don't create permanent majorities and permanent minorities. That if you're in a minority one day, you could be in a majority the next day. You know that. And you know that in that why your views are respected, and so you're not excluded from the story. And the other is that, and it's funny, is that they're cross-country cleavages. So not everyone is in one camp or in another camp. They're not all correlated. Kind of trust in bounded communities, whether they're national or European. But my God, and that's a my question to you, so how about generational change? What I see with my kids is that for many young people, the European level is actually not the most important. It's the means to 2 other ends that they feel is more important, global and the local. They don't necessarily like
at least patriotism that veers on nationalism, the risks of othering, whether you're national or whether you are European, proud to be European, but that means you're not something else. Maybe they prefer, Barcelona and the world. So there is a question there about sensitivity and about a kind of cosmopolitan sensitivity very present, perhaps in a certain class of your socializers, among your young Europeans. But do we necessarily applaud this, bounded and sometimes exclusionary double patriotism, European and national? Although, it has a lot of good things speaking for it. So that's one first kind of area, anthropological area that I wonder about. The second is the point you both made about more and more desire for Europe. Hey, Europe, do things for us. Whether it's vis-a-vis Russia or whether it's vis-a-vis climate change or COVID. And I would say that, the question that your report raises is, yes, more at the European level, but the more X, what is X? So you say X is peace. Yes, peace, but what peace? For many Europeans remain very split on whether peace with Russia means kind of compromising fast, or whether, and that's kind of more like justice, or whether, that's peace now, or whether, we stall and make sure we do everything Ukraine says, even at the cost of freezing this winter. And so there are different trade-offs about peace and definitions of peace, and is it social peace? And perhaps the report or our conversation from the report can go further. And then similarly with some of the other policy priorities that you raise. So external protection, yes, people love the word protection, the Europe that protects. And we can see why, yes, but isn't it the case that your cleavages between types of persons, your 5 wonderful types of Europeans, relate to protection quite differently if we dig down? What do they consider as unfair? How much of a risk taker they are? Do they, and also, are they really ready to have protection vis-a-vis developing countries? On what ground, if you can't have enough climate change policies in your country? So again, if we dig, what happens? And then similarly, you talk about very rightly that what you read is a desire to upgrade at the European level the social market economy. But do we think that the trade-off, and this is the social democrat speaking in me, there's a good old dichotomy that perhaps you haven't dug enough into, which is capital versus labor, or capitalists versus workers. And, the debates right now on the super profit, show it in various ways, but also on kind of eco-socialism, that maybe there are differences that may not be covered by some of your categories of protection. So maybe we want to ask about that. And finally, in the cultural sphere, fantastic findings, which are not all obvious. Like this, one of the breaks you have, one of the categories you have, is how Central Europeans are much more supportive of technological progress, more open to change in that kind of innovative way, like go get it, and which I kind of in a way recognize from anecdotal evidence, but it's not something that's so well known. And there's a lot of this in the report. There's many cliches, because you also have the traditionalist Central European. So part of your story, very, very important for us here in Europe, is to show that we don't want to reify this East-West cleavage. There are some elements of cleavages, but others not. And so, and here you do say so rightly that once you look at your value clusters, the creatives and the socializers, etc., that they are cross-cutting. They're cross-cutting across countries. We have them everywhere. That's super important if we consider the importance of cross-cuttingness at European level. But I would say then, does that not come into conflict with another ideal that we have in Europe, free movement of people, where it is shown that there is some clustering between these kinds of peoples, and that the socializers, want to live with the socializers, and the traditionalists with the traditionalists. And we have a lot of, especially young people, I see it from Greece, for instance, who move, where they decide to move to countries that they feel are closer, or to even districts or cities that are closer to their values. And so free movement sometimes can create maybe a more exclusionary communities. And maybe we need to kind of ask that question, although it's a sacrosanct question, and we're not going to break the desire to see free movement. But how do we maintain that healthy mix? And your solution is my solution, absolutely. I call this the threshold of acceptable or legitimate differences. And what you're saying is, let's make the debate explicit in Europe as to what we really, really need to share. So let's say LGBT rights, basic rights of expressions, but not some of the social mores that follow from them. So like the very specifics of adoption, children adoption, or even certain aspects of marriage, or certain aspects. So we want women's right in all their way, but what happens inside the family, well, of course, you don't beat your children and stuff like that, but there we give leeway. So what Europeans need to have a conversation about is not say, hey, the more pro-European I am, the more I want to have these European rules on all these morality questions. No, but I want to have a Euro-wide conversation about what is the threshold of acceptable difference if we live together in a European polity. And that's what your report highlights, and it's beautiful, both analytically, anthropologically, and prescriptively. And so that's just some of the very picking up just very few of the very important socio-anthropological point, but very quickly, because I'm running out of time, Federico. There's two other ways in which the report is so important, beyond the anthropology of it all, is really the political. And you say it, because this has very concrete and real political implications. First of all, that our two big families, Christian and Social Democrats, need to wake up and smell the coffee. And yes, they often work together, for instance, in the European Parliament, but they both have a narrative that is still informed. In fact, that's what you both were saying, and the president, you were all saying, I call this the tyranny of dichotomy. The good guys and the bad guys, us versus the others, we're pro-Europeans, anti-Europeans. And that's what you were saying. Now, we all need to politically break this narrative and enter a realm that is still not consensual, but of third ways, because this tyranny of dichotomy excludes very important people. Among others, what I call transformative Eurosceptics. Not existential Eurosceptics who simply want to get rid of the EU altogether. We don't like that. We shouldn't like that. But a lot of Eurosceptics, and I've known many of them, including in the EP or in the national parties, social movements, etc., who really have had for many years, even decades, important questions about the centralizing tendency of the EU, its non-transparencies, bureaucratization, the iron cage that Weber would talk about, all of these questions which becoming more and more mainstream. But with the tyranny of dichotomy, we've not taken them seriously enough. So this all calls for a different kind of politics, beyond a kind of cosmopolitan nationalist divide or whatever it is. And that is going to be a very exciting and interesting politics. And this leads me to my third and last what's at stake point, which is philosophical. Now, Federico is not going to be surprised by the fact that I'm going to invoke here the fact that for the last 20 years, I have defended a philosophy of the EU, which I call democracy. That is, European Union is and is becoming and should be and should stay a union of peoples who govern together but not as one. That's how I've defined it. And there are many scholars and thinkers who have followed in this kind of paradigm. And this paradigm is so important, for one, because yes, it's not teleological. There's not some brilliant paradise out there that one day we will reach. It's dynamic. It's always about managing these difficult trade-offs between what is core and what should be made autonomous. It's not getting these terms like federalist reify, and it will be very important for me to hear our next speakers. I myself did a book on federalism, 25 years ago, where I think it's not about whether we keep or not keep the label, is that we need to distinguish between a federal state, the good old boring federal, vision that is centralizing and a vision that is horizontal, of a federal union. And that's what democracy is. It's trying to get our political imagination away from Europe as a centralizing desire and more towards a desire for overlap and conversation between the European peoples in all of their differences. So this is where the words, not just subsidiarity, but indeed mutual recognition of our regulation, of our politics, of our cultures, of our values, you become so important, but is very complicated to manage. And where another word becomes very, very important is this idea of political ambivalence. Because a lot of your finding will show that people are both want stuff up, Europe does more, but also down. We do more at the local level, up and down. I want both. I want more local and more European, but also I want more cultural tolerance, but I also want more cultural integrity, etc. People are ambivalent. And you know where we see this best is when you do citizens' assembly, where people suddenly can own their ambivalence, can accept that they believe a bit in cooperation, but they also believe in taking back control. Yeah, you can believe two apparently contradictory things at once, because our values are complex and our interaction is complex. And this is where I would say the next phase of your report comes, if I may, Federico, and I just want to end on this, because to me, that's the next stage. When we do surveys, we do a snapshot. We ask people, what do you think in the here and now? And this is fascinating. But at the end of the day, democracy is about deliberation. It's about, if not changing radically my mind, but kind of evolving, because I'm talking with you and you're talking with me. And now at coffee break after this, you're going to have lots of conversation. You might change your mind. If that's the case, then I would say that we need much more deliberation among people in Europe, which is why the next phase is to debate your report in the citizens' assemblies for Europe.
Thank you very much, Calypso. There is a lot of issues that you raised. As you said, we have been discussing some of them for years. I could see Paolo Rangel nodding in some moments, but also shaking his head in other moments. So I would suggest, we will come back to address some of these issues during the discussion after also Paolo Rangel has Eddie say, but I would suggest that we allow him immediately to react to everything he has heard so far, because he has been very patient.
Well, I don't know if this is working. I think it is, no? The micro? Yes. Yeah. It's okay. Okay, so I will stand up because this is the perfect chair to see all of you, because I'm not tall, but then to see you when I speak, it's more comfortable to be here. And so let me first thank for your invitation and for this very, very, I'd say, interesting debate, reflection. I'd like to start to say something only because I was presented as a EU federalist, and I am indeed. But the problem is, what is federalism? Because this presentation of federalism that my predecessor, she presented, is not the only one. If you look at Belgium, federalism is decentralization and not centralization. It's exactly the opposite. It was a unitary state that came to a federal state. And so it's the other way around. And so when we teach federalism, we always say there's a lot of federal models. The federal model of Switzerland has nothing to do with Germany. Germany is much more centralized. And so we can live with different federalisms. And of course, at European level, to have a federation will imply always a quite decentralized federation, probably the most decentralized ever. So this is only for the sake of some clarity on concepts. Then let me say that this is really a fantastic survey. I understand that it has its limits, but the countries that were chosen don't represent the diversity of Europe. You don't have any country from the corner. Finland, Ireland, Portugal, Greece. And these are countries with a very different experience of what is Europe, because they are really far away from everywhere. And so I'm not saying that probably at the end the conclusions will be the very same. I'm not saying, but it is a different insight. Only to say that I don't understand why, for instance, is Belgium and Holland, because they are looking from the outside, they are the same. And I know that I'm saying this because you took the assumption that Portugal is Spain, and this is totally wrong. Because Portugal is an island surrounded by Spain and sea. So it's very different from, only to say that, okay, we have to look at this, and especially this kind, Finland, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, they have experiences that are not the Central European experience. Because at the end, this is only Central Europe. It's not peripheral Europe. Probably Sweden could be. But the rest are everybody from the bubble that had a lot of wars within them, but this was not the case of the others. And so only to say that these experiences are. And then let me tell you something that I found very interesting, that you also said in your study is clear, is that the lower class, is where the divisions are, I'd say, really big. In the richer countries, the lower class is quite open. In the others, it's much more, I'd say, conservative. But this is because the lower class of the very, very developed countries is more than the middle class of the other countries. So probably at the end, it's not a problem of being lower class or higher class. It's a problem of having decent standard of living or not. And this should also be taken into account. This is a quite Marxist reflection, because I'm saying that economic and social are still very important to define the behavior and attitudes of the electorate and public opinion. But in a certain way, your conclusion confirms that. Because if the standard of living is good, and for a higher class in Hungary and Poland is probably so good as it is in Germany or in Netherlands, even with some differences, for the lower class it's not the same. A poor in Sweden is not a poor in Portugal or in Greece. It's totally different to be poor. And so we should also see that probably this is not so geographical, it's also social economic conditionality in a certain way. But okay, this is only a reflection on these assumptions. And then I would, to be quite brief, go to 2 or 3 main conclusions to say if I think that they are a good trend or not. In the case of morality, I'd say gender issues and so on, I think that the conclusion is correct. Because if you look at traditional federalist theory, family issues are a matter that is not for the federation. If you look at the United States or other experiences of federation, normally family law is state-level law, as criminal law, normally. And so I'd say that this is quite, I could expect that, and this is not understood, unfortunately, for a lot of people, for instance, in the European Parliament or in the European Commission. They don't understand that that is what is expectable from this kind of political entity like a federation, is that these kind of issues, criminal law also, with some exceptions, naturally, and of course, a Charter of Freedoms and the Declaration of Rights always imply that this is the same level of protection to all the Union, but this can then have some differences. For instance, it was quite instructive that we can have some rights that are then, I'd say, shaped. The development of some rights are shaped at national level. This I could live with this, so I think this is acceptable. Then when we look at defense, for me there is a great issue that we should achieve. Of course, people are very moved by the Russian aggression. And so these answers are clearly, I'd say, motivated also by the moment that we live, because nobody would speak about peace before, because they didn't think that there was a risk of war. Even if some countries and some governments all across these years have warned, this is going to happen, please be aware, there is a real risk, this is not only fantasy or some trauma from the past that we have, this is reality. What I would say is that here, in my view, it lacks a lot the Atlantic and relationship. I would say as a very committed European, but also as a Portuguese, I would say that I don't see any possibility of having a common defense without a strong tie to the United States. And so this is something, and I have to say, this is not only, I'd say, a claim from a very, very far west country, but is from the eastern countries. If you look at the Baltics, or Poland, or Hungary, or Romania, they always want that there is a very, very strong tie with the United States. So they believe that we can have an European pillar of defense, but under the umbrella of NATO. And this is something that I would say that is really crucial. But of course, when people, they answer, it's natural that now they claim for a common defense because they need protection, they are afraid, they are really, and we saw even if you speak with, I'd say, our electorate, people that are not so engaged in politics, they are really, with, for instance, yesterday attacks and strikes, I saw that 2 or 3 people that I wouldn't say that are not really linked to the global politics and so on, they text me, how is this dangerous, what is going to happen, things are changing, and so it's really that this is at stake. Then let me go to something that I think that is very, very, is probably the best, not the best, the most useful conclusion, and by the way, is the first, but it is really something that is totally true, that to be a true European, you don't have to give up your nationality, your patriotism, your nationalism. This is very clear in my view. In some countries like Ireland or Greece or Portugal, I always have seen that everybody is very nationalistic, not necessarily in a very, I'd say, noisy way, but when they have something fundamental, they are there. But they are true, they really love Europe and they like to be Europeans and they like to be in the European Union. And this is also the lesson of the Baltics, for instance. The Baltics are very, very nationalistic for very clear reasons. And I could say the same to Finland, for instance, and to Poland, because they were under threats, terrible threats in their own identity in the last, I'd say, centuries. We're not only speaking about 10 or 15 years. And at the same time, they are really very, very pro-European because they see that it's Europe that also protects their identity. Because as Europe is diversity, they have an opportunity to leave their nationalism within an umbrella that respects that nationalism. And this is really a message that I believe is very important. Why? Because of the far-right movements that we have today that tend normally to say, even if sometimes they moderate the speech, but their belief is that European Union could be, in the best scenario, something useful for intergovernmental dialogue. and okay, some negotiation and probably some common measures, but always under this idea of a very traditional international organization where everybody has to agree. And here, for the center-right and for Christian Democrats and for People's Party, conservative liberal parties, I would say, this, for them, this is very important to show that we can, it's totally compatible. In a certain way, it's really something natural, spontaneous, that you are very proud of your country, of your identity, and at the same time, you are also very comfortable and even proud and happy with European citizenship and European belonging feeling. So I think this is also something really very reassuring. It's really something that, and that gives us also, I would say, some clues to develop some policies. One thing that I think that is very important to address, and that's also a lot to do with, I'd say, identity by one hand, and with economy by the other hand, is migration. And how we look at not at the other European, but how we look at the third states, we could say, or the foreigners that come to work. This is why, because if I look at the far right, and I will conclude.
1 minute left.
Yes, I will do it in 45 seconds. When I look at the far right today, or the radical right, probably is better to say like this, what I see is that they are very different in Italy, in France, in Poland, in Hungary, in Sweden, and all across the other countries, in Spain or even in Portugal now, etc., or in Denmark or Netherlands. But there is something that is always common, is the migration speech, for all of them. Then there are a lot of them that are progressive in morality, a lot of them that are against Russia, others that are pro-Russian, but migration is the common link of all these movements. And a center-right movement has naturally to address this issue in order to see how to bring this electorate to a more moderate approach towards all the big questions of our European politics. And okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Two very, very long but very substantial, two rather long but very substantial contributions, which is why I hesitated to interrupt either of you. But I think now we are really laid the ground very nicely for the debate. And I am even ready to open it up for questions from the floor if there are any at this stage. And I already see 2 hands up. So I would start 3 hands up. So I will start with the lady here.
I would like to thank you, all of you, and especially Mr. Rangel for what he said. In fact, first of all, I had the question before he talked, how did you choose the countries? Because there was certainly a part missing. I know that there is a tendency to say that everything is concentrated in the core of Europe and we should extend it to the recent members of the European Union, but we shouldn't forget the periphery, because otherwise the periphery feels left out. So if you say about feelings of the Europeans without taking into account the periphery, I think it's a bit dangerous. Although I agree almost with everything Mr. Rangel said, I would like to point out a thing. Of course, we need NATO for our defense. But let's see what's happening recently. First, with a member of NATO concerning Sweden and Finland. Second, with the same member of NATO concerning the attacks, the promised attacks on another member of NATO. So can Europe afford not to have their own possibilities if all members of NATO don't agree on certain points? Shouldn't we have the possibility, unless we don't have unanimity in NATO, as it is the case in the European Union? But there is a point about this, and we should examine it. And even if we don't want it, we should point out that we are examining it so that people who are hindering joint decisions can think a bit more about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I suggest that we take at least two at once. There is a gentleman over there.
Matteo, sorry, it's a bit loud. Matteo Perezzoli from Circolo Esperia. Question for MEP Rangel. You're always very inspiring, also when you come to our events. So I have a philosophical question for you. First of all, I wanted to say that the whole study can be kind of summed up in Anna Karenina, in Tolstoy. That reminds me of the quote, "Happy families are all alike, and every happy family is unhappy in its own way," as you can see, you know, between the Cosmopolitan and all the other ones. So my question to you is, how do we reconcile, because you're standing in front of this unity and diversity, how do we reconcile, basically going forward as Europeans, ethnic differences, okay, within the common home, okay, of democracy and freedom, because at the end of the day, what we're witnessing right now is an ethnic conflict. And it was very clear because Lavrov went on Russian television 3 days after the invasion, and he made it clear that he wanted to stop the US and the Western world from making the whole big thing one giant melting pot, without remembering that we've been a melting pot since Caracalla in 211 with the Constitutio Antoniana gave the citizenship to everyone in the Roman Empire, so we went past the tribal level. So how do we do that going forward? Because that is really the big question.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. So I suggest that we come back to the floor. There are at least two other gentlemen. I'll come back to take their questions. But let me just briefly say something about two issues that were raised, two sort of criticisms, which I think are well, one of them is fair, I find. The issue of the country choice, first of all, and then maybe you can also say something about that. The logic was, the reasons why we had to settle for a limited number of countries was essentially budgetary. So there was no ideological consideration there. We tried to account for as much as possible for the diversity and for the regional diversity of the union and for cultural diversity. But of course, we had to do it within certain budgetary constraints. It was very far from us the bizarre thought that Portugal is Spain. No, that was not the reason why we did not include Portugal.
But I have to say something. In all studies are always the same countries. Always. I come to EPP and say always, more or less these 9 or 10 are always the same.
But
I don't know if it is budgetary reasons, but or to make it comparable because it's the same sample, but then you lose a lot.
I can tell you that there is a follow-up study that we are preparing now, which will have certainly Portugal and
But well, I can give up with Portugal. I'm not saying this is not a national vindication. It's only to say that we have to look also to other perspectives.
The second point is on Atlanticism. I think, I mean, you all know the Martin Center. Nobody can doubt, I think, our Atlantis is credentials.
Of course, yes.
Our president was known as the American when he was prime minister in Slovakia. He's the man who brought Slovakia in NATO and the EU, so we are passionately Atlanticist. The strategic question here is a different one. The strategic question is, in 50 years, you know, are we going to have a balanced alliance in which there is a strong European pillar that is capable of autonomous action within a transatlantic alliance, within a strong NATO, or are we going to outsource our defense to our best allies forever and never grow up, never take responsibility? So that's, I think, the strategic question, which I think is also what the lady was asking you. So that's I come back to the floor to ask you to address the two questions that were raised so far, and if you want to also add something, Anna, later.
On the issue of ethnic Well, I think that it depends on what we are speaking about. If we are speaking about European diversity, of course, it applies totally to the ethnic differences within Europe. Europeans are quite different, even if at the end there is also a lot of common heritage. Then what I think that is the way that Lavrov was speaking is that we are receiving people from Asia and from Africa, and so that is undermining, I'd say, the European true DNA. That's what he intends to say, but this is a very, very typical Nazi assumption, I'd say, and we know what that doesn't, what that does mean, and so I think that we are really a very open society, capable of living with diversity. Of course, if you look at United States, Canada, or Australia, or New Zealand, probably they are even more, I'd say, open to this diversity with their own problems. We know that what is also especially the issues in the United States, but not only. But we are really a very diverse society, and so I don't know that I don't think that there is an issue. Another issue is how to tackle these migrations flows, and here we have, and that is not necessarily an ethnic division, but it can also be, especially if we speak about religion and so on, so totally different habits, and this is something that we have to address, how to cope with this situation, because we see that there is a substantial amount of population that are a bit afraid of this. This has also to do with globalization in a certain way, the groups that lost a lot with globalization and that we simply, didn't care so much about them, and so now they come from sometimes from the radical left to the radical right, and we see this movement everywhere across Europe. And so we have to look at this issue, but I wouldn't say that we don't have any risk of contamination, because contamination, as you said, since Caracalla is our fate, and so this is not so bad. Then I don't know if I...
the NATO question?
Yes.
NATO-EU question.
NATO-EU question, and this is also to do with Atlanticism. And I will say that I'm fully supportive of developing European, now this is a very personal thing, has nothing to do with the survey. So it's what is my view. I fully support that we should develop a lot of defense capacities, not only this procurement issue that is quite consensual, but I'd say also to have some capacity to be in some operational theaters and to help and so on. But I have to say that I'm not in favor of an European army. So one thing is to have some military capabilities, to have a very strong cooperation and coordination. Another thing is to have an European army. Here, personally, I must say that I think this would be a very difficult experience for us. And so I'm going to be very open. I still rely very much on the alliance with the United States and United Kingdom. But this can be very much a national thing, because, as you know, Portugal has very, very strong ties with both, and especially with United Kingdom. And so for us, it's very important that we keep this always Atlantic. I would say that in that respect, I think that we have a lot to progress, a lot in defense capabilities, a lot of things that we can do together, but I would always keep this tie to the Atlantic.
Okay, that's very clear. Anna, if you allow me, I would take the other two questions, then give you the floor
Sure.
first to address whatever you want,
Yep.
and then maybe give the last word to Paolo Rangel, because we have been taking up quite some time at the beginning, so I think it's only fair that we should rebalance the situation now. So there are two questions, the gentleman here and the gentleman at the back there.
Thank you very much indeed for your instructive presentation and in particular for the report as such. I have a question. Seeing all these infographics and the colors in particular, very often and almost all the time overlap national borders within the EU. And I wonder how far it makes sense anymore to see the national borders as the borders for surveys like that. Of course, there is a difference for languages. That's one case. But it's possible, for instance, to group all the German-speaking, French-speaking, whatever-speaking languages together, and I think there might be even some value confluence in these all different areas. For my personal opinion as a European, I think this would make more of an effective European indication of diversity and unity than just seeing the national border as still in the Westphalian system being absolute and sovereign, which is not the case in our supranational EU. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back.
Thank you. You hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. I'm very pleased to see you all again. Long time no see. Even though I am not always in agreement with what you are saying. My name is Professor Linson. I'm a neuroscientist interested in politics. My question is rather disruptive. Has or can the EU have any future with a warmongering European Commission president-imposed European troublemaker? I mean, the Russian intervention was provoked and could have been prevented. All Putin needed was a nudge that was graciously given in pure cold blood, knowing perfectly well what would be the consequences. So has the EU any future with this kind of European Commission president?
The question's clear, I think. It's basically a criticism of the Western strategy towards Russia. Okay, so Anne, I'll give you a couple of minutes to wrap up, say whatever you want to say before the end. And
so let's go a few things. So let's start with the last one. So what has happened before, if you take the old paradigm and the new paradigm, so the old paradigm, Brexit moment, and then new paradigm, Kiev moment. Just mark it as two things. So one is division based on nationalist cosmopolitan divide, which I think the first speaker said very good. It's actually much more cleavages that are cross-cutting, but where through our media environment, political environment, we just see this dichotomy. And this, of course, was being used by Russia to also make a story about threats, but about internal threats, about fifth column, we talked about ethnic division, and about the sellout of the cosmopolitans with the fifth column. That was basically the story of this dichotomy. Now what happened, and you can call it warmongering or you can call it whatever you want, but what happened is that we moved with the Kiev momentum into a moment of external threats. So where internal threats, when you make them bigger, causes division, and when you structure it into one dichotomy, it polarizes. In this kind of new political and media environment in which we are, and actually was already starting to move into that direction before the Ukraine invasion, which the report shows on all kind of policy areas, you have now this external threat being made bigger, which unites. So I think that for the last question, to put that into the structure of how we looked at the report and the data. On the country selection, I think very fair point. Let me also take some blame here. We had a database with certain countries that we had a lot of data about, And that made it also possible to use old data that we already had and combine it with new data. So part of it was our discussion indeed with Martin Center. Does these countries that we already have data on reflect sufficient diversity, values diversity in Europe? And we also did some surveys indeed when you look at Sweden and the difference with Finland. I almost fell off my chair when I did that first time because I know nothing about Finland. Finland is more like half Polish, half Swedish than another Sweden. So fair point, and I think we're addressing that in some new.
Will agree with you on that. But
No.
Let's pass this one. Let's see. Did we have another one?
Conclude though, because we are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Values, differences, following borders. The last one. So that's why the report looks at it two ways. So it looks at value segments across Europe. So we don't make any difference between borders, but we look at people with the same kind of values. So creative in Germany and a creative in Poland are merged together in the analysis. And the other level is borders. And when you look at values research, there's a lot of academic research in it, we still see that actually the values differences between countries are still very important. So also from an academic point of view, it's very useful, like we do, to also cross-cut and use these value segments, but you should not lose also sight on how important borders are still for identity. And in fact, that's also a case that's made in this report. So for example, national identity is still the most important geographical identity. We measured it in the report and we see it in values difference. So that's why we did it both.
Okay, thanks, Arne. Last word to Paolo Rangel.
Well, let me say that two very small things. One is addressing the issue of the disruptive question, that I fundamentally disagree with that. And so I don't think that it was Europe that caused this. Another thing is to look how we should look at the relation between Europe and Russia, European Union and Russia. I think that we have always to have not to say that Kremlin and Russian people are the same. So we have to have this very clearly in mind, and not to have a kind of anti-Russian phobic or Russian phobic attitude towards Russian culture. Against every cancellation that we see that now we cannot listen to Stravinsky or Tchaikovsky or read Tolstoy. This is totally nuts and stupid and something that we cannot accept in any case. But another thing is to see who is responsible for what, and Putin is responsible for the situation where we are. And I don't think that we haven't done anything that could in any case motivate or justify what Kremlin is doing. And so here I would be, and this has nothing to do with the President of the Commission, I have to say. Only a second thing on this countries thing again, only to say that this is not for me nothing fundamental, but next time you have better data about these 9 or 10 countries. Yes. And then you'll say, we have data about this, let's do with them, because they reflect diversity. And this is not clearly the case. At least it has to be proved. And it is assumed without any evidence that it is like this.
Yeah, that's a fair criticism. Thank you very much. So I apologize, but I had been told that Calypso had left, and now I see her back in a different greener background. Can you hear me, Calypso?
I think there is no.
It seems to be frozen.
Yes.
So if she cannot hear us, I guess.
I can.
Can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Do you have any last thought, Calypso? Because the connection is not excellent. We cannot hear you very well.
I'm sorry because I'm on the move now. But I just wanted to simply say that this study is really a first in its belief and in demonstration that there is a third way for Europe that is grounded on what people think and what they do in their everyday life. Really not big ideology. And so there's a lot at stake in your study. I think the next step has to do with going deeper into the policy implications. And I very much would like to invite you and all the team to present this at the European University Institute in Florence, where we will continue to debate across ideological divides in Europe. So thank you very much for having me and for your patience in my last step.
Thank you, Calypso. I agree with you that this is just the first step, and if we can come to the UI, I'm sure that there will be plenty of other ideas, and we can build on that, because as you said, the challenge is to work out a third way. Then politically, everybody who wants will try to embody it. Of course, we hope that it will be the center right in 2024, and I think if the EPP manages to articulate this third way vision, we have a big likelihood of deflating, right-wing populism and of being again the strongest force in the European Parliament after 2024. But that's politics, and we will discuss science at the EUI, Calypso, don't worry. So I would like to thank you all for your participation, for your questions. There is a lot more that we could have discussed. We only scratched the surface, but we have to bring it to a close. Thanks a lot, and let's thank our speakers with a round of applause.